So a little bit on cognition, re-cognition, right? Recognition, and decognition. So cognition for me is when you're sitting there and you just hear your mind, your kind of little familiar mind working on its hamster wheel and talking about its usual things, talking about where it wants to eat, how it feels about what that person said, what it's thinking about for the future. In a way, you know that you're in cognition is nothing you're hearing is really kind of surprising you, impressing you, standing out as insightful or original or helpful. It's kind of almost like the mind just kind of spewing out its kind of pet topics and pet concerns. And as with anything, there's nothing ultimately wrong with cognition. As it arises, it's perfect. The issue is it just keeps us stuck and we can get kind of loopy. I think of it kind of like a beautiful flowing river that gets poured into a swamp and then it gets still and it gets scummy. This is what happens when we allow our minds to loop for too long in cognition. And we as conscious beings who identify very strongly with our minds, the more our minds get in this kind of cognition swampy state, the more we just become kind of the victims of our own habits. And we just find ourselves thinking and then saying things and then acting out in ways that if we really sat down with a blank slate, we would never do, but we just feel such an inertia and such a familiarity with them, we kind of almost feel like we don't know any better. And the tools we have to get out of the traps of cognition and to expand the spheres of our thinking are recognition or recognition and decognition. So recognition is really just the act of noticing that we're in cognition. So for example, if I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, oh God, when is the gardener going to call us back? Right? I know we're having issues with the sprinklers, right? When's that goddamn gardener going to call us back? Oh, how long has it been? Oh, it's been a week since we called them. Okay, what do we do? What do we do? Again, the thought arising, nothing wrong with it. It's just sometimes the mind can chew on this for minutes, hours, or days, and it really brings a lot of negativity in. So I think the technique here is recognize that that's happening, and you can add the tag if you want to. Just say, oh, there's cognition, there's thinking, there's my mind just kind of churning out thought, getting hung up on stuff. And it's an opportunity to soften our connection to it, to not get as swept up in it. It'll come back again. That's how things tend to go. I think it gets on kind of limbic cycle loops. You may see it coming back in intervals of 8 seconds, 20 seconds, a minute or so. And just each time it comes, just be like, oh yeah, cognition. Oh yeah, cognition. You're not trying to hit a home run when you do it. You're not trying to steal thunder from the gods. We're not trying to go for something fantastic. That's an ego game, right? We're just trying to develop better habits. So we see that cognition arise. We use recognition or recognition to break our entrancement with it and to begin to build inside the ability of the mind to see when cognition's happening and to recognize getting caught up in cognition isn't where we want to be. We want our minds to be showing us possibilities. We want our minds to be showing us fresh things, things that are exciting, things that are invigorating. And we've got to train our attention to not be so grabby and just shoving the usual cognition in, getting the fresh stuff. So recognition, simply the act of recognizing, softening, and letting it be. It's boring, it's frustrating, it's not satisfying or appealing to the mind, but if you look, you'll notice the body will relax a little bit. When it happens, the heart will soften a little bit, and that's what we want to do. Now, even more powerful than recognition is decognition, right? And they can actually work hand in hand. So cognition is occurring. I'm, for example, giving myself a hard time about my dietary habits. I'm saying, Joe, you got to cut out those dried pineapple fruits you got. Turns out they've got all this added sugar in there. I didn't realize it's more like a candy than a fruit. Oh, blah, blah, blah. And then, spider webs out into all kinds of different guilt trips and things like that. Cognition. Decognition. Decognition for me is this experience. There's kind of a expansiveness to it. And what's scary about it from the position of the operating mind, the ego, is it feels vacant. It feels spacious. And I think the ego deliberately keeps this space dangerous feeling because it doesn't like decognition. It doesn't like recognition. It likes cognition. Cognition is familiar. Cognition has all its usual pet issues and hangups and insecurities baked into it. So the ego's happy. The ego's keeping its agenda in check, its ideas of self-improvement for us, things like that. Using re-cognition, cognition. Using decognition. Which with practice, you can get to a point where you really aren't thinking much during that time. Cognition is not arising nearly as intently. Training decognition, I think, is really the next step and the most powerful tool. Like all things, it's a habit, right? We're not going to have that fireworks moment necessarily that the ego wants. We're going to have all that satisfaction. But if you do it and just notice the subtle gains you make moment to moment and over time, this is a very powerful way to break our entrancement to thought. So cognition, and eyes twitching, vacant, hung up. Maybe we're tightening places. I tighten down in my nether regions a little bit when this happens. Recognition, soften. And if we're in a hurry, maybe we only do the recognition. Okay, cognition, okay. And the decognition is kind of the gong. Spaciousness, opening, relaxation. And what's wild about it is if what we're chasing after is epiphany or beautiful mind, all these things, again, if we're chasing right there, we know, okay, we're playing the ego game, we're clinging, we're actually back into cognition. The more you can spend in kind of this spacious state, right? And this is what the Zen teachers talk about, the beginner's mind, kind of the no mind. Not something you can establish as a permanent state and not something you can cling after. It's just something you can do in the moment. And this is where it kind of comes full circle and you begin to actually appreciate cognition with gratitude. I think Rumi had a line that Sufism is defined as the sudden joy when disappointment comes. And the way I think that happens is just through training. Cognition's occurring, we begin to feel tight, we begin to feel heavy, we recognize it, we decognize, we get a spaciousness, and in that spaciousness and in the training of that spaciousness, it's really the heart space and the mind space opening, which I don't know if there's anything really we can do in a moment that's a greater gift to ourselves than to open the heart space and to open the mind space. It makes things so much more possible. And the world is so much less of a crushing, curling place and more of an opening, inviting place. And so what you begin to do is then actually develop gratitude for cognition because it is the cue for you to practice your gifts to yourself, which are re-cognition and decognition. And so in that highest state, when things are really flowing, the cognition comes. And as you switch into re-cognition, you actually feel gratitude as well because you're finally getting re-invited to do the practice you want. And you can't, if you do re-cognition as a prompt or on an alarm or something like that, like you had a reminder on your phone every 5 minutes to recognize and decognize, you can get benefit out of that. But I think the juiciest grape, you might say, is the organic arising of it, the cognition, the recognition, the decognition, and the gratitude that permeates it all. And that gratitude is that gateway back to the unity and the creator consciousness because you're appreciating, yes, I'm not just a monkey fending for myself in space in a world of limited resources and treachery and all the other things we can get into in our minds, right? The mind of drama. You can really get back into the mind of peacefulness, the mind of unity consciousness, the mind of creator consciousness. And again, if you're expecting that to be a rainbows and a unicorns experience all the time, just do the same thing. Recognize that's cognition. That's kind of the old, maybe childhood fantasy way of thinking about it. Now you can do the more mature and fruitful approach, which is moment to moment. Recognition, decognition. Gratitude for this individual unfolding, and maybe a little bit of hope for over time the benefits that will come from consistently using this practice to soften our attachments, soften our attachments, soften our attachments. And softening attachments is really, I think, ultimately the game, because if this is all perfection already, but it doesn't seem that way, it must be because there's something the mind is clinging on to that just makes it hard to believe. It makes disbelief more powerful than faith, When we say, do you think it's perfect or not? Really, from our bones, we would say, no, it's not. It's cruel, it's harsh, it hurts. I look out at the world, I see so many things that are wrong, so many things that are unacceptable, so many things that a loving God would never create. When we do this practice more and more, we begin to soften that and realize that it's actually that attitude of approval and disapproval, and that kind of deification of our own approval and disapproval, that way we have of making approval or disapproval kind of the starting point. And if we disapprove of something, we then kind of run with that and we almost don't see the good anymore. That's cognition. Oh, there it is. Easier said than done, and there's sometimes it's really hard to do. That's a great opportunity to practice compassion. If you're stuck in cognition loops, you're trying your recognition and your decognition and it's not coming, that's when you can just go, maybe what I really need for myself is some compassion, to recognize I'm suffering right now, I'm in pain right now, and what can you do to yourself? You know what you can do. Now, I mean, you can go for something like a treat or something like that. Nothing wrong with that, of course. But really what your body and your mind are asking for is you to give yourself the gift of your own presence. That means you need to close your eyes for a little bit. Take a relaxing breath or two, maybe even step away from whatever you're caught up in right now and just let yourself reset. If you can make that a habit, if that becomes your new conditioning, is to gradually decondition, right? Condition, deconditioning. Now we're getting into something a little clever in the game that can lead to better things over time.